Putin shut down internet as Crimea faces zero-day 2 to 5 million people without water and gasoline.
Why is this city, the second northern capital after Moscow, living like it's the Middle Ages?
Look closely at this darkness on the map. The lights are going out one by one across the geography of the Russian Federation. But this darkness did not start at a single point. It spread like a virus. The country is being systematically plunged into darkness, starting from the east and moving north to south. Along this line stretching from Ulyanovsk to Crimea and even St. Petersburg, Putin is targeting the most dangerous regions for the regime in a panic. It all started in the east, in Ulyanovsk. For months, the regime has been quietly using this region as a testing ground and restricting the internet. While people in the east have been trying to get used to months of blackouts, the reaction was much harsher when the crisis hit St. Petersburg in the north. Banking systems collapsed, and electronic money turned into virtual nothingness.
Our internet hasn't been working at all for 2 days. I mean, not at all. Not in the city center, not in the Leningrad region, nowhere.
The people's anger spilled onto the streets. The cry of, was actually the echo of this tunnel of fear stretching from Ulyanovsk to St. Petersburg. And on the night of December 23rd, the final and most deadly link in this chain descended southward to Crimea. This is no longer just a digital disruption. It is a full-scale strangulation operation. Because in Crimea, the people are fighting a survival battle reminiscent of the Mad Max film. On the night of December 23rd, the Kremlin locked 2.5 million people in a digital cell. But digital isolation is only one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin, mud flowing from the taps instead of water, people fighting at gas stations, and the Kerch Bridge turned into a concentration camp military zone. When we examine the technical anatomy of the incident with the meticulousness of an OSINT analyst, the picture that emerges points to a state suicide. It all began when Russia's digital censorship infrastructure backbone, the technical tools for countering threats, TSPU systems, were switched to total isolation mode, first in Ulyanovsk and then in the Crimea region. These systems, normally used to block opposition websites, were transformed into a weapon that completely severed civilian communication in Crimea as of December 23rd. The official statement by Crimean authorities laid out the situation with chilling clarity, without even attempting to conceal it. There will be no internet until the special military operation is over. Just accept it. This phrase, just accept it, is proof that the contract between the state and its citizens has been unilaterally terminated. However, this digital isolation was only the visible, virtual side of the coin. On the other side of the coin, a physical apocalypse was unfolding. The simultaneous collapse of water, fuel, and transportation. First, let's look at the water crisis. That is, how the source of life has dried up. NASA's FIRMS data and high-resolution images from the Sentinel-2 satellite undeniably reveal the state of the Izobilnoye Dam, the main source of life feeding the southern coast of Crimea. The grey areas you see were once a 70-meter deep body of water that gave life to the city of Alushta. Today, it is a cracked pit with its bottom exposed. According to official reports, the water level in the reservoir has fallen below the critical threshold, and the capacity to supply water to the region is now limited to just 3 months. However, for the people of Crimea, the real horror began when the escape routes were closed. Crimea is no longer a strategic stronghold for Moscow. It is a massive death trap where millions of people and an entire army are stranded. The Kerch Bridge is currently locked down with an impenetrable police barricade. The miles-long lines of vehicles you see on the screen are not just simple traffic jams. This is the most concrete, most terrifying manifestation of the strangulation the peninsula is experiencing. Russian security services have turned the bridge into what resembles a concentration camp. The 212 checkpoints that will be set up from December 26th to January 11th, under the pretext of the approaching holidays, are proof that the system is based not on security, but on complete panic. At these checkpoints, 17,500 vehicles will be inspected daily. Each car will be thoroughly searched, and passengers will be questioned regarding potential saboteurs or draft dodgers. While the goal is to inspect thousands of vehicles per day at these points, searching every vehicle for operational suspicion could cause a serious slowdown in the civilian transport chain. The long queues of vehicles forming at the bridge entrances are not only a waiting period for civilian drivers, but also pose a risk of a supply paralysis in the delivery of essential goods to the peninsula. With the Kerch Bridge restricted or turned into a civilian torture line, Crimea is becoming an isolated region facing a strategic island syndrome. This logistical bottleneck is also pulling market balances within Crimea to a delicate point. The possibility of a disruption in market shipments could trigger the question among the public, what will happen to food security if the bridge closes completely? And a tendency to stockpile. The limited capacity of ferries and the variability of winter conditions are turning the peninsula's self-sufficiency into a major strategic question mark. What is happening in Crimea now is not just a logistical disruption, but a rehearsal for social collapse. Look at this image. A man in Crimea is stealing gasoline from his neighbor's car. This is a Mad Max dystopia. Gas stations in Crimea are no longer fuel points, but battlefields. Fights over a drop of fuel are the most brutal proof of the strangulation the peninsula is experiencing. This crisis peaked with the December 14th coup. Ukrainian SSO forces struck a strategic fuel train in Crimea with FPV drones, crippling the Russian army's mobility and triggering a civilian crisis. With the fuel trains being hit and the control crisis on the bridge, gas stations across the peninsula began to run dry one by one. Images shared on social media show people waiting for hours in front of empty pumps, even physically fighting each other for the last drops of fuel. These images shatter the illusion that the Kremlin has been trying to build for years. Everything is normal in Crimea. Stability is complete. Queues at fuel stations stretch for miles. AI-95 gasoline and diesel are completely depleted in many districts. In large cities like Simferopol, gasoline is now only sold with coupons or cards. Drivers, in desperation, ask, "Where is their fuel?" in local chat groups, while prices have skyrocketed to 90 rubles. The most striking and dangerous reflection of the fuel crisis is seen in the reaction of taxi drivers and the transport sector. With fuel prices falling on the black market and availability decreasing, taxi drivers have threatened to strike and have reached the point of shutting down. When taxis and transport vehicles stop in an area, life comes to a standstill. The civil anger caused by this situation turned into complete chaos when taxi drivers started a strike by turning off their engines. City transportation has come to a standstill, public services are collapsing, and daily life in Crimea is paralyzed. The reason behind the shortage is not just a train attack, it is systematic destruction. Ukraine's more than 180 attacks on Russian refineries throughout 2025 reduced Russia's refining capacity by 25% and increased domestic fuel shortages to 20%. Crimea is on the front lines of this logistical apocalypse. While the Kremlin spins lies about weather conditions and ferry disruptions, the real culprits are the refineries and terminals hit by Ukrainian drones. Panic among the population is turning into a civil mutiny. Market shelves are emptying, people are stockpiling supplies, and fuel thefts are increasing daily. Ukraine's attacks on refineries and storage facilities have forced Russia to reduce its hydrocarbon taxes by 34%, and this budget deficit is directly impacting civilian life on the front lines and in Crimea. The ripple effect of this technical collapse cannot be limited to a mere logistical crisis. It is a sledgehammer blow that shatters the psychological backbone of Russian society. The simultaneous depletion of water and fuel in Crimea, combined with the internet outage in St. Petersburg, shattered the illusion of a powerful state in the minds of the Russian people. Imagine for a moment someone living in Crimea. Struggling with thirst, they need gasoline to run their generator, but there are miles-long queues at gas stations. Even if they find gasoline, there is no internet to connect them to the world when they run their generator. This is not modern life. It is a survival simulation. This situation is turning into a logistics apartheid imposed by the Russian state. By allocating its limited fuel and food resources solely to its army, the Russian state is condemning the civilian population to deprivation. The prioritization of fuel for military convoys has led to the cessation of civilian transportation and hospitals being unable to find generator fuel. The fear of freezing is looming. The targeting of fuel trains has brought civilian heating systems to a standstill. This pressure on energy facilities and transformer stations indirectly affects water pumping systems and central heating networks, undermining the comfort of civilian life. Crimeans face the horror of facing the approaching winter in cold and dark rooms. The peninsula, home to 2.5 million people, is at risk of freezing. In a modern society, where everything from heating systems to water, internet, and transportation depends on electricity and fuel, these restrictions are tantamount to a death sentence. Russia is so isolated that it cannot even get help from its allies. Even more striking is the familial trauma this situation creates. The breakdown in communication turns every home into an isolated island. A Russian man's desperate confession on social media sums up the situation.
То я не смогу зайти там и прочитать сообщение от мамы. Чё, блядь, за бред?
Even Vladimir Vladimirovich said they shouldn't ban the people from so many things. But what can you do? Russians are very obedient. But the real panic begins when this silence turns into rebellion. And here we enter a phase of civil uprising rarely seen in Russian history. The people are no longer just complaining, they are suing the state. The class action lawsuits filed against the WhatsApp and Telegram bans are proof that Russian society has overcome its wall of fear. While this may appear to be a legal battle, it is actually a test of civil disobedience against the regime. Unrest is growing in Russia. Your phone has turned into a brick. You have to pay cash in stores. This situation has turned daily life into a practical impossibility. In an authoritarian regime, citizens taking the state to court is not a simple legal case, but a war declared on the system's legitimacy. People are now trying to corner Roskomnadzor, the state's censorship fist, in courtrooms. This is a legal preview of the impending major internal chaos. And most importantly, that cry we heard at the beginning of the video, "We are not North Korea." This slogan is the expression of the deepest fear in the Russian collective unconscious. Russians may be accustomed to poverty or war, but they are not prepared for the idea of becoming a pariah state, completely isolated from the world, plunged into darkness, without internet or fuel. This voice rising on the streets of St. Petersburg is the scenario the Kremlin fears most. We call the strategic phenomenon we are witnessing here systemic cannibalism. In order to remain in power and continue the war, the Putin regime is sacrificing, one by one, the vital organs that keep the Russian state alive. A modern state derives its power from communication and the economy. However, under the pretext of security, the Kremlin cut off the internet in St. Petersburg and Crimea, severing the arteries of its own economy. This is not a strategy to win the war, it is a panic reaction. Ukraine's long-range drones and cyber operations have been so effective that Russia, unable to defend itself, has chosen the path of shutdown. This situation is the final nail in the coffin of Russia's great power status. A superpower does not become unable to provide its citizens with water or fuel. A superpower does not cut off the internet in its capital and plunge its people into medieval darkness. These events show that Russia has transformed from a geopolitical actor into a closed-off, paranoid, and resource-depleted giant imitation of North Korea. Economically, this situation is also unsustainable. Crimea is a region dependent on tourism and agricultural revenues. However, the blockade brought about by the war has ended the tourism season before it even began, and is also preventing the export of agricultural products. With the bombing of the Novorossiysk port and the threat to maritime trade, the economic cycle in the region is coming to a standstill. The cost of Russia's subsidies to Crimea is increasing every day. Moscow is forced to pour billions of rubles from its economy, already struggling with sanctions, just to keep Crimea afloat. But without fuel, money is nothing more than a piece of paper. That night, the Russian people woke up to a bitter truth. The state is not protecting them. The state is locking them in a cage without water, fuel, or internet to protect itself from them. The cracks in that dried-up dam in Crimea and the empty gas pumps are actually cracks in the foundation of the Russian Federation. And those people in Crimea, waiting with water jugs in their hands, shouting, "We are not North Korea!" on the streets of St. Petersburg, are just the first winds of the approaching storm. The lights went out, the water ran out, the fuel is gone, and time is running out for the Kremlin. Russia has pressed the self-destruct button. We are just watching the countdown. So, what do you think about this? Please share your thoughts in the comments.